go. Break it down, put it there, bring it on, step it up. Right there, break it down, put it there. Here we go, step it up, bring it on, let's go.
Hey everyone, good afternoon and welcome to the live stream of Studium Generale Eindhoven. It's a beautiful day to be talking about a very important topic, which is the issue of race, or ras as we say in Dutch. It's a term we often rather like to avoid because it's a sensitive term, politically, culturally, and certainly also scientifically. There's a long track record of problematic research about race that has made the term a bit of a taboo. Yet many recent scientific developments, for example, in the fields of forensic science, are co-shaped by techniques that actually depend on biological differences between human populations. Discussing this issue, both in science and in society, is badly needed. And one of the best people we could think of to discuss this with is anthropologist Amade M'charek, who examines the way racial ideas affect science, forensic research, and ultimately society. Amade M'charek is professor of anthropology of science at the University of Amsterdam. She's a socially engaged researcher with a focus on forensics, forensic anthropology, and race. Currently, she leads the project Race Face ID, where she examines forensic technologies of giving a face to an unknown suspect and how that actually ties in with race. Amade, let me welcome you to our live stream. There you are. Nice to have you here, and the digital floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marla. Wonderful to be here. I feel pressed a little bit because there's so much that we could talk about. I am happy that we're having this conversation about the issues of race and about the problems of even uttering the word race. You mentioned race and ras, and I have problems with the Dutch word, and I tend to bracket it or put it with a question mark or what have you. I won't go into that now. I will focus on a few examples from forensics just to give you an idea of how complicated this notion of race is, and also how it is among us actually in so many ways. But before that, let me just to warm you up, give you this film, The Face of Flitter. Mark, could you please put it on screen for us? Thank you, Mark, for that. So what you have been looking at is not a sci-fi film or something like that. It is a real-time, real existing something. It presents a fairly novel technology of a commercial company, a US-based commercial company, Parabon. I will come to it later. It is a company that is gaining more and more space in the forensic field and going international, so to speak. But let us start in, say, a fairly calm and clean environment, the White House. So I'm going to take you back in time. There we go. So what you see here is, for many of you, these are not very familiar faces, but they're very important faces, such as Bill Clinton, former president of the United States. On screen, Tony Blair, who is the former prime minister of the UK, and two scientists flanking Bill Clinton there, because something grand is being presented there, which is the draft version of the first genetic map of human beings. And to that moment, and it really speaks to the communality in the genes, so to speak, communality in the genome. Bill Clinton said, I believe that one of the great truths to emerge from this triumphant expedition inside the human genome is that in genetic terms, all human beings, regardless of race, are more than 99% the same. So we are the same. We don't have to worry about race. Lots of money has gone into this project, and everybody was nervous about a kind of return of racism, but we are the same. However, the ink was not dry, and it was not really the 99.9% of sameness that got so much attention, but really the 0.1% of difference. And you see this across the board in the field where genetics has come to play a role. Obviously in the medical field, medical genetics, but also genetic genealogy. So all these commercial tests where you can send in your swab to know where your ancestors came from or how you relate to certain ancestors. Archaeogenetics that teaches us more and more about the history of us human beings and also our relations to others. Think of the Neanderthal, and obviously also the field of forensic genetics. And I cannot elaborate too much on this, but just to give you an example, and that it is really this focus on difference is contributing to a kind of return of race, even if race, as I put here on slide, has never really left us, and genetic research is contributing to that. Now, to your left, right, you see a clip from an article that was published in the New York Times by a very famous geneticist, David Reich, who has been very, high standard kind of researcher. And in this article, he sort of insinuated that what we find in our DNA when we look into genetic diversity somehow coincides with social classifications that we make, which kind of prove that genetic race and social race map onto each other, thus race seem to exist. This led to huge controversy to which many scientists have spoken. And below that, you see another example of white supremacists who are using the DNA to show that they're really 100% European, have European descent. And nowadays, more and more, the Neanderthal gene has become something that is so much cherished as a kind of the ultimate marker of Europeanness. Those who have this Neanderthal genealogy are assumed to be the true Europeans. While this is, of course, very problematic, all of it. But just to show you how everyday genetic research has become, and also as an example for many to prove their pureness in the race. Now, to bring this all closer to the topic of today, which is forensic and forensic genetics. I am sure that you're all aware of this forensic DNA and how it has contributed to the field of policing. Now, forensic DNA, it has been introduced in the late 80s, really, to the field of policing. And initially, it was based on a comparisons between a sample that you find at the crime scene and the sample taken from the suspect. And you could look for whether they matched or not. But it has increasingly developed in not just a tool to identify the suspect at hand, but also to look for an unknown suspect. So you have biological traces and you don't know who this guy is. Usually it is a guy. So many different kinds of technologies are in place to do that. You could do DNA database searches, or you could do, a population screening. You call in all sorts of citizens that are of interest and try to find the suspect there. But there are other technologies as well. And so here to show you how we did this in the Netherlands, we introduced a legislation which was ahead of the technology, in fact. in 2003, where the aim was to, based on the traces that you find at a crime scene, to produce the visible characteristics of the unknown suspect. So basically, a kind of a face of the suspect. And I found it very interesting and intriguing that our legislation says there, although the word, as I said earlier, ras is really a very problematic word in Dutch, not to be compared or mistaken for the English version of it. We can discuss that maybe later. But in our Dutch criminal code, it says that you could use this technology to determine the sex, race, and other externally visible characteristics of this unknown suspect. Now, when I read this in 2003, and I was already working a bit on forensic DNA, it was really alarming to me. And it slowly but surely led to this project that Marle mentioned at the beginning, which is the Race Face ID project, where I really wanted to query this issue of race. How is race then becoming relevant in this field of forensics, and focusing precisely on the face, because the face, as we tend to think of it, is a highly individualizing aspect of our body, right? You cannot mistake faces, one face for the other. So we look at 3 different technologies. One is forensic genetics, as you can see on the left. In the middle is craniofacial reconstruction, which is often about unknown victims of crime. And then the very classical facial composite based on eyewitness account. And we look at the relation between the individual and the collective, and how slowly this collective turns into a racialized category, where it happens, why it happens, what relevance it has in that particular moment for the criminal investigation. So to think about face and race, but maybe race in general, I tend to use these prints that were produced by a physical anthropologist, Rudolf Martin, in the early 20th century. They were produced actually to teach physical anthropologists how to distinguish between races. So you have to really look at these faces, to look at these images, to stare at them, and slowly gain that knowledge, to embody that knowledge of doing difference. And what I find intriguing about these images, and there are many of them, and they have been distributed widely also after that to the wider public through encyclopedia, is that what you see is at the first instance, you think you are looking at faces, and you're looking at physicalities of these faces there. But these faces do not come by themselves. They all come with ornamentations, about hairdos, about jewelry that people wear, about clothing. And this is, I think, a very productive way to think about race. We tend to think about race as a biological marker or quality, but it has never been like that. Race has always been a kind of relation between biological qualities, biological markers, and cultural, social, environmental markers. Even language comes in, smell comes in, and there have been books upon books upon books written about this from data collected in the colony and elsewhere. So when we think about race, it really is a nature culture assemblage, and I cannot repeat that enough, even in a laboratory setting. So I want to take you back in time in this technology of giving a face to an unknown person by, I will use 3 cases very briefly. And the case here is the so-called case of the night stalker, which is a case of rape, murder, and burglary in London. And as you can see here in the south of London, 1992 to 2009, when it was solved. Now, in this guy, at least 203 victims, mostly elderly ladies, and it was really a problem. Who is it? And in 2006, the London Police Metropole, called in the help of a commercial company, DNA Print Genomics. The picture that you see here, the composite, is based on eyewitness accounts, so there is no DNA involved. Now, this commercial company, had developed a DNA witness tool, DNA 2.0, and it says that you can learn details about the donor's appearance, as you can see here. This is one of their commercial publications. It gives you a partial reconstruction of the driver's license photo of this person that you don't know his identity. Now, how many times have you wished an unknown suspect would leave his driver's license at the scene? So this is how individualizing this technology promises to be. Now, the profile that they produced really looked like this, based on the DNA witness kit. So 82%, based on the DNA, 82% of lineage with sub-Saharan Africa, 12% Native American, 6% European, 0% Asian. And I wonder what you, for example, would make of this profile. How would this guy look like in practice? Now, you have to take into account that we are in London, we are in the UK. So the colonial history, which is not such a history, is important here. Because the police had read this profile as a profile of somebody who stems from Afro-Caribbean background. Probably the Windward Islands, and the kit was developed by this company, which is a US-based company, and had to be optimized because it was not very informative for the guy that they were looking for in London. So upon that, and this is important, what does this profile do in the world to really make the profile more precise? Policemen with a background in the Caribbean were more or less forced to give their DNA to help specify the profile further. So maybe 100 policemen, staff that were from the Caribbean were invited, as it is called, to donate their DNA. And many of them protested, obviously. But based on this conclusion that it is probably somebody from Afro-Caribbean origin, 21,000 people in South London were suspected and or seen as possible suspects with DNA dragnets among them, etc. Thousands of them were invited for this dragnet. So what you see here is actually two things that I find important to point out. One is that without the context in where the crime happened and where the DNA is being studied, we cannot understand, or this technology does not really help us to understand what kind of person we are looking for. So there's a translation made from this probabilistic profile that points to large places in the world to a very concrete specificity that has to do with the history of a specific location, such as the colonial past of the UK. The other is that the DNA profile is not done. It is not ready when it comes out of the lab. It starts to work together actually with many aspects that are happening outside the lab, such as inviting policemen to donate the DNA, forcing not by law, people in a particular area that live in a particular area to step forward and to prove that they are innocent. So this is what we need to keep in mind, and specifically when we are talking about minority populations. So in the end, this was in the end they found the night stalker, so to speak, and not on the basis of this DNA work, but really because he was recorded by a CCTV camera when he was taking money with the bank from a bank account of one of his victims. So this is how he, in the end, was found. And many of the suspects that were found, even when this DNA technologies have been used, were actually found by other means rather than just DNA. So where do we stand then with this technology now? Just a quick state-of-the-art sort of slide. It has always been possible to differentiate between the sexes, unless there are sexual dysmorphies or we are dealing with a transgender person, because that happens as well. There are cases of that. So sex is rather straightforward. Geographical ancestry, which is translated in a Dutch law into race, is probabilistic, and the same holds for eye color, hair color, skin color. They're all probabilistic, but they are validated markers that are now being used. Now, age, facial form, and height are still being studied as possible markers to give a face to this unknown person. Now, on the left of this slide, you see here some interesting skulls. This is research that has been conducted here in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, where 7 genes have been identified that are related to the upper part of the facial form, the skull, really. And I want to pause with that a little bit. And here you see a little bit more of that same paper, because it is instructive for us. What we see here is genetic research, and of course, genetic research is state-of-the-art genetic research. We see also fMRI scans that have been taken from that face. So, and it is working towards individuality. So this is really a moment where you think we are leaving race behind. We are leaving this kind of categorizations of people that I showed you earlier, based on the print, right? So faces that become sort of types for certain races. This is not what this is about here. But keep in mind that this research cannot be done without this earlier research. We have to be aware that in universities, in laboratories, we are working with sedimented histories. There's a kind of, it's not a linear accumulation. We are not moving towards better, but there is this history of science is among us, and we work with it. So here, what you see here are protocols for studying the skull that are based on that vested history of race, where we were collecting skulls as well as so many other physical features, classifying it, producing protocols in how to classify, etc., etc. Now, these kind of classifications that are based on racial science are part and parcel of the software that is used to analyze these modern features. So, in the sense, race is folded into the technology. It is not written about in the paper. It is irrelevant to the scientists that are working on these kind of technologies, but it is written, hidden in black box in certain technologies. Not always, but often enough. Now, I don't want to be this critical person, and I was really like, it might be that the future will be individuation and not this necessary clinging of individuals and collectives. We might be moving towards, developing novel technologies to really point out individuals. Until I stumbled over this this quote, which is a quote of a police officer, a forensic police officer, and he says here, what does the picture have to do look very much exactly like the perpetrator to be effective? No, it is not, he says. In contrast to the commonly held belief that highly detailed or photographic images are more effective, these images actually narrow the scope of interpretation on the part of the viewer, who then concludes, I don't know this person, and moves on, instead of considering the likenesses. Now, And this is really interesting because you think that the more realistic and detailed the image is, the better we can then individualize. But that is not the case, at least not for the purpose of criminal investigation. Now, this indicates that incompleteness is a virtue rather than a bad quality in criminal investigation. And why is that? Because it is key for these technologies. They have to go public, these technologies, and their aim is to draw us in as members of the public to help give them more content and contours in order for the police to limit the scope, right? You cannot look at millions of people. You have to limit that scope in order to make it practicable and researchable. So, and this is also because these technologies, they are not so much aimed at the individual, they're aimed at a collective. So incompleteness of these technologies produces not the individual suspect, but a suspect population. And this is where the sting of racism is really palpable, because using this technology, and when this technology points at the general population, as it did, for example, in the very famous Marianne Vaatstra case here in the Netherlands, already in 2001, it was suggested that the perpetrator who killed and raped Marianne Vaatstra was probably a Dutch white man. Well, that didn't help us much. We had to wait until 2012 with novel technologies in order to find the suspect. You see, but if it points to a minority population, then it becomes interesting because it limits the pool of possible suspects. Now, if you have minority populations that are being suspected, then the problem of stigmatization, violence, racism is really not far away. Let me now take you back to this company Parabon that we encountered at the beginning. And let me see how to address this issue. So what you see here is one of the first phases. No, it's not one of, it is the very first phase that this company has produced, trying to help out in a criminal investigation. It was a murder of Kendra Alston and her daughter in South Carolina, and the police went to this company, could you please help out? And this is then the phase that they produced. A very generic phase, one could say. I want to highlight to you that the most important markers here, but also in the technology, in the papers that have been published about this technology, it is there up front, are the differentiation of sex. So here we see that the sex of this person is male, as well as ancestry. We see here the 92% of this ancestry lays in West Africa, 8% in Northwest Europe. Now you might wonder if this is the most important information that we have. Now, what happens in the machinery of this company, I cannot go into details there, but you should know that they have a database that consists of photographic material of persons, but they also have their DNA. So, and they match their DNA, ancestry and sex, but also the other markers onto each other. And then you start to look. You have the DNA of the unknown person, and you look what kind of similarities can I find there in my database. First based on his sex and ancestry, and then you add you produce a base phase, and then you add the other markers. So the red West African origin is really important here, because we cannot know how this unknown person must have looked like, how his ears looked like, what kind of hair do he has, the width of his nose, the lips, the eye, even his eyebrow, we don't know. And you see here that the West African origin becomes a flagging for a kind of stereotypical appearance of this person. And also in this case, I mean, for me, this picture is really not so much different from the prints that I showed you at the beginning, the physical anthropological prints. Also here, we are working with all these different elements of West African descent and the face, the scientific data that is presented to us there. Usually in other representations of this case, they also have a telephone number of the police that you can call. So all these things work together for us to give this face a kind of racial identity, rather than individualize him as a person. Another case in which this technology has been used is here the Brockton rapist and murder in 2016. This is the final case that I would like to discuss with you. What you see here is a press conference with the mayor and the police, and let me show you what is stated here, because it highlights yet another aspect of this technology. The mayor here of Brockton says to the audience, at the end of the day, I should tell you something about what we see here. So here we have, again, the same thing about skin color, eye color, hair color, freckles, and above the most important things, sex and ancestry, African admixture. Now, this, in this case, this led the police officer to conclude that probably the suspect is Cape Verdean. Why? Because in Brockton, it has the highest number of citizens from Cape Verdean descent in the United States. So again, this technology is very much located. If it's the same profile appears elsewhere, we would translate this into a different persona with a different history, so to speak. So it is probably a person from Cape Verdean descent. And here the mayor says, at the end of the day, we need some help from the public, in particularly, in this case, pointing towards our rather large Cape Verdean community. We need someone to take a good look at this illustration, point us in the right direction. Now, what is implied here? So first, of course, it is a responsibilization of a certain community for certain deeds in society, right? So, and I've seen this elsewhere as well. I've seen this also here in Brussels, where a murder case happened, and it was assumed that it was somebody from Moroccan descent, and there was really lots of pressure on the Moroccan community that were hiding murderers to step forward and reveal the identity. In the end, it was not a Moroccan person, but a person from Polish descent. So you see the sort of mixtures. Because Brussels has a large Moroccan community, the suspect was assumed to be Moroccan. So in this case, a sensibilization of the Cape Verdean community. And also hidden in this is the psychological research. I don't know whether people in the audience have the psychological background and are aware of this, or own race own race. Oh my God, I forgot the E. Never mind. So the idea that you recognize people that are from your own race better than others is also implied in this technology. They can recognize the person here. For us, you know, white Americans, it is difficult to differentiate between one race and the other, whereas it's actually the technology that is fairly generic and not so individualizing. You see also how the public respond to these kind of images. These are just some example. I feel I know him. I want his head on a stick. That's how I thought he'd look like. And please catch this predator. So people relate to, so these faces become then affective faces, and they're affective, and I also call them tentacular, because they tend to feed on so many different actors and publics in so many different ways. Now my last slide, I hope this is has been somehow clarifying what is going on in forensics. This is, by the way, not to say that we should not use genetic forensic technologies. I think there's a lot that can be done with it. What I want to point at is actually that these are very problematic, political, potentially violent sort of technologies, that we need to use them with lots of care for citizens, for communities, and also care for the kind of language that we use when we talk about these technologies or make them public, or maybe we should decide not to make them public in certain cases. So there's lots of questions. They raise questions, just like our main topic here today. I think raises questions, and there should always be raise question mark. It can never be, I'm going to read this out to you because it's fairly brief. Race can never be race, period. It can never be self-evident. And it should always be accompanied with this question mark, race, question mark. I'm very moralistic here, but I really mean it, and we can talk about this in a bit if you like. So race is not a matter of fact, something that can be discovered in our bodies, our genes, our faces for that matter, but it is a matter of concern. We cannot but relate to it, I would say, with curiosity, as something that invites us, even if it is ugly. Right? We need to be curious, something that invites us to raise questions about it. What is race made to be in practice? Is it skin color, national identity, genetic relatedness, cultural practices, or other elements? What does it take to bring race into being? What kind of technologies, old and new? What kind of vested interests? What kind of ideas about difference and in science and society? And this is important because the history of race demands this from us. I did not talk too much about this, but you can imagine that race history is a history of violence. And precisely because it is not just a history of violence, slavery, and colonialism, it is not a history left behind. This history seeps through our current day practice. It is folded in so many ways in our current day's practice. So we have to keep on paying attention. Thank you.
Amade, thank you very much for sharing these insights with us. Let me also invite the audience, if you have questions for Amade, you can use the chat function both on YouTube and on Facebook. I see we have the first questions coming in. Maybe first of all, Amade, you've shown these examples of where forensic science applies race in a way that has consequences that aren't good, just to summarize it very shallow way. But do you think that's mostly ignorance, or is it are there racist elements at play as well? How to interpret the use of, for example, this profiling that you've showed?
I think ignorance, but really as in lack of better words. So there is, of course, an interest of scientists to show that they really are not racists, and that they are aware of this kind of problems, so to speak. But there's a kind of naivety about the technology that they are using. And also, so that is one. So there's a lack of knowledge about the history of these technologies and how they are interfering, in a sense, with current day practices. So that is something that can be repaired, but you need a kind of open space for it and openness towards it, right? And the other thing is, I find really problematic is the persistent idea that we do the science and society does the rest. And what we see with forensic, it is an example par excellence, where there is a constant circulation between science and society. As I showed here, you know, these profiles are useless if they do not somehow get filled in and hook in with all sorts of societal knowledge and ideas. So this is something that needs to be reckoned with, and something that needs to be acknowledged as part and parcel of this forensic knowledge that we are producing. That would be helpful. So we need actually more conversations about this. But I don't, although there are many problems in policing and ethnic profiling and what have you, the scientists that I have been engaging with and working with across the board have been really very nervous about race and racism.
Yeah, because you mentioned, because we often consider science to be neutral. Do you agree with that in this respect?
Well, I agree that we consider science to be neutral, but it is not, of course.
It is not, right? Yeah.
No. No, I mean, if the examples that I've shown here already show that it is a pre-structured field, not that we are determined by these structures, right? And that we are limited. It is not a vacuum space where you can follow certain scientific interests, but it is there's a lot to take on board and into account.
Okay, I see we have a few questions coming in about something that both of us referred to early on, which is the difference between the American word race and the Dutch word ras, which is more problematic, the Dutch word, as you mentioned already. Can you elaborate a little bit on this? For example, people are asking what is problematic about ras?
Yeah, I think the way we have been working with this word, ras, is problematic. So the word race has really been embraced by civil rights movements, social movements in the US to define social groups, so to speak, right? And to require equal treatment based on this definition. So race has become more and more a social category rather than a biological category. With us here in Europe, with continental Europe, I mean, we suffer. I mean, the US has its own suffering to do with its past, but we also, we have been involved in slavery, in colonialism, the Second World War massacres and genocides. So we were quite relieved actually when in 1951 the UNESCO statement on race was produced, saying, well, there is no scientific evidence for race and we should actually use the word population in science and ethnicity in society. So that was really like, okay, we throw away the word, because it is all about biology and biologically it doesn't exist. So we throw it away and we have been using other kinds of category mostly. So ethnicity, taalverschillen, language differences, cultural differences, religious differences. So these are the words that are being used. So the moment you mobilize the word ras, you really mobilize biology as a kind of essentializing naturalization of differences. And I think we need to think really hard about that, what it does. I think that you utter the word and it already homogenizes and essentializes a group. And that's precisely because we have not been working with this notion of race, and we have not been using it for categorizing people in continental Europe.
Okay, so maybe an interesting follow-up question is we've imported a lot of terminology from, for example, the States, right? When it comes to this discussion, to what extent do you think it compares here in the Netherlands or here in Europe to the situation in the United States, for example? There's always a lot of debate about that, like when it comes to terms of institutional racism, for example. Are we importing the ideas, or is it similar here?
It is not that similar in the sense that we have strong states here, we have strong institutions, and I think our institutions are also machineries for making sameness, right, producing equality, and that's what they meant for. But it does not. So in that sense, I feel this is really quite different from the United States, where these institutions have not been that strong in the last a decennia or so. So inequalities is much more crude, one could say, in the States than here, and the checks and balances are not that well in place. So you cannot compare ethnic profiling for example, in the Netherlands to ethnic profiling and policing in the United States. It's completely commercialized, the police system there. Okay. But it doesn't mean that we don't have institutional racism. I mean, what I was talking about for forensics, this kind of sedimented histories are here as well, and I think we and in that sense, it is absolutely good to compare the States to continental Europe or to the Netherlands, and on these parts, right, the issue of institutional racism. So there are differences and there are similarities, and that we should take into account.
Okay, great, thanks. I see that officially we're running out of time, so I'm just going to point out to the bachelor students that if you would like to register for use for this event, you can now find the link in the chat function. I thought maybe, Amade, it would be interesting, since we have a few minutes left before you have to go on to your next class. I read that you have studied a very local example for us in Eindhoven, which was Marcus of Eindhoven.
Yeah.
I thought it was a very interesting example of well, how race and genetics and all that interplay can actually work out. Could you maybe share that story with us as a final example?
Oh, okay. Yes, I mean there was archaeological dug in Eindhoven. When was it? In 2006 or earlier, even, where there was a renovation of a square in the city center, and they found a large number of skeletons in underneath the church, and also the skeleton of this young boy whose place of burial was very much near the altar, and so the city archaeologist Nico Arts, he decided, first of all, it was a huge event. So CNN and everybody was there because it was contemplated that maybe because there were so many skeletons and it spanned a long history, that it would be helpful. Research on these skeletons would help us to understand certain epidemic diseases and what have you, even HIV and all that. But of this young boy, a reconstruction was produced, a facial reconstruction, the technology that I showed you also within our project, and he was assumed to belong to a very important family, and he was made actually into a noble person. And his DNA was studied, and it pointed actually more to the Mediterranean region. But funnily enough, his reconstruction was a very, very white, red-haired, blue-eyed boy. And in addition to that, studying the skull, he was assumed to be very ill, to die early because he was malnutrition and what have you. But then his face was beautiful and chubby, and so you see actually that Marcus had to become, he was called Marcus of Eindhoven. He had to become this beautiful boy to represent the city of Eindhoven. There's much more that can be told about Marcus, because but I find so how the DNA did not match the way he looked, how the fact that he was ill, his teeth, looking at these, did not match the way, the health of Marcus. So I think he, at a certain moment, he became the first citizen of Eindhoven. And this is to show you how ideological these kind of things can.
Yeah, exactly. I thought it was very, in a way, a subtle example that you don't really consciously are aware of when you see this image of this boy, I guess. But knowing that actually it's not very representative of what he probably looked like, it says something about how we frame history as well, I think. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, this is really important. I mean, genetics and how it has changed actually our view and how it is reconstructing our past and as well as our future is just amazing. It's everywhere. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Amade, thank you very much again for joining us today. I hope we've been able to shed some light on the complications of this issue, but also very much the importance of discussing it whenever we can. So thank you very much on behalf of everyone at home. For the viewers of Studium Generale, if you're interested in joining one of our other programs, tonight we have a documentary, Economia, which is about the workings of the capitalist system. And next week we have another Wednesday lunch lecture backed by popular demand, Dr. Donna Carroll, who is going to be discussing the very fascinating history of computer chips. So we hope to see you again next time. And thanks for joining us today. Have a good day.
Thank you.